Okay. All right.
Don't forget to say your name.
All right, welcome everyone. Okay, Russ, yeah, thank you. I was reminded after the first panel this weekend, I didn't introduce myself after it, and then remembered at the end yesterday. So I guess I'll introduce myself first. Thanks, Russ. Tim Sexauer, creator of the Muse Ecology podcast, amongst whatever else we do. And yeah, I'm very pleased. I think first I will just introduce by name, and everybody can give a shout so their face can pop on the screen if they're there, just to get everybody's presence or cyber presence real quick, and then we'll go into kind of an intro and we'll weave a tale of complexity together. So first, and like I've said to the folks online, I'm going to let you, if you could just give a brief introduction of yourself to kind of save time, and then that'll be nice and quick. So, and we'll go in the order that we'll speak. So remember who you're behind, okay? And then we'll weave this story. Charles.
Yeah, Charles Eisenstein. I'm a writer.
Okay. Professor Mian.
Hello. I'm just an applied meteorologist. Can you hear me?
A very good one, as I've heard, yes. All right, Dee Dee.
Dee Dee Pursehouse, writer and educator.
Okay, wonderful. Walter.
Yes, hello, Walter Yana, just a microbiologist, soil microbiologist from down under. But yeah, look, I've been involved in that land soil regeneration story for a long time and very pleased to contribute.
Wonderful. Thank you, Walter. At 3:30 in the morning, for those who missed that, he's with us, yeah. Zach.
My name is Zach Weiss, and I'm a contractor creating water retention landscapes.
Wonderful. Neil.
Hey all, I'm Neil Sparkman. I'm a desert worker and aspiring businessman.
Nice. I love these minimal titles here. All right. Minnie.
Hi, I'm Minnie. I work with, I run an NGO and I work with communities across the world who work with traditional ways of managing their landscape.
Wonderful. And Judith Schwartz.
Hi, I'm Judy, and I'm a journalist and author based in southern Vermont.
Wonderful. All right. Well, let's get started. This is, I'm really looking forward to this. Much respect for everybody on this panel and everybody here. Thank you all for coming. It occurred to me, and I went up just looking out over the ocean in the sailboats after checking some of your talk, and that whole what's the enemy to kill thing. And I realized how appropriate it is and how kind of powerful an acupuncture point that we're doing this here in military base, you know. This feels appropriate, and it feels appropriate for this panel in particular. You know, we think about climate and what's the enemy that we can kill, you know? What can we reduce this problem to so we can think about it really simply, make an economy out of it and all that. And so in this, we're going to get into what Professor Mian, I've heard, called the other leg of anthropogenic climate change. So wasn't sure if I was going to mention it, but since Charles mentioned it in his talk this morning, the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth. It's a very interesting read. It's where you see, you know, we've just found these cuneiform tablets in the last 100 years and begun translating them. There's millions we haven't. But this is where you see the origin of shift from matriarchy to patriarchy. You see slavery, first use being to drain the wetlands of the Fertile Crescent. And you see this, what I like to call I've started to call the basic thermodynamic error of Babylon that we're still living. So you mentioned the two gods, Tiamat and Apsu, the first ones. But you didn't say who they were, which is nice. So you set me up to flesh it out a little bit more. So Tiamat, the original, the wild, the salty, the water's moving over the surface of the deep. And then out of that came the two gods, male and female. Apsu, the sweetwater god, flowing into Tiamat, the saltwater god. And out of the union of these, the brackish union of these two, came all the other gods, Anu, the sky god, and all these other things. So they had that part, you know. And then there was this is chaotic. We have to, you know, first we killed Apsu, the Sweetwater god, and put the city on the body of that. And then, like you mentioned, then we slay the mother and create a world out of her body, the wild mother. So the basic thermodynamic error being mistaking the natural order for chaos, thinking it needs to be tamed and controlled. And in our efforts to do that over the last several thousand years, it's led to more and more chaos, because the natural order is actually what keeps chaos at bay. And it's this mother who's always seeking to protect us from this, all of us, because we're all in this together, we're all one body together, flying through space and all this chaos, right? And there's so much order. So this is about order, call to order here. As Dan Young said in his book, he's got a book about ecosystem restoration, climate change, and open systems thermodynamics. Talks about looking at the thing through the realm of complexity and order and entropy. And how we have three coupled autocatalytic thermodynamic systems: the biosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere. And we've really messed up the biosphere and the hydrosphere. So the atmosphere is forced to export all the entropy, you know, chaos. So we're going to get into that in this panel. We're going to get into what are the stories that hold us into this, and also what are some of the science of this, of the relationship between the biosphere and the hydrosphere and the atmosphere. And it's not as easily reduced as the stories we often dwell in when we think of climate. It's a story of complexity. So I'm going to sit back with you guys as we begin in the order we just did, and we'll go 8 to 10 minutes each to start off. And we will together, like when you each tell a story at a party and then you end up with a story, together we will weave a tale of complexity.
Oh, yeah. I'm really honored to be on this panel. Some of these people here on Zoom are people who I read doing the research for my book. I wrote a book called Climate, A New Story. And yeah, so these are some thought leaders who are reconceiving the planet as an organism with a physiology. So much gets left out when we see the Earth as a complicated machine rather than a complex, sacred being. So yeah, I'm really honored to be with Professor Mian here, Walter Jana, Judy, I know you already. And I'm kind of wanting to let these folks do more of the talking and use less of my time. Let me see if there's one thing I want to say though. Apparently not. Maybe later I'll have something to say, but I really do want to hear the wisdom of these other people on the panel.
Maybe you want to do a few minutes at the end.
Maybe.
We'll shift it around.
Yeah,
we'll
maybe I can.
If you feel it.
Sum things up. Yeah.
Yeah. So Professor Mian.
Okay. Hello to everybody, and really glad to be in the panel, and thank you very much. Well, my work, I come from an engineering background. I studied aeronautical engineering, specializing in fluid mechanics, and I have designed instruments for various things, including the metal detector gates at the airports that you suffer every time you fly around. I designed those. My work began in Canada. I joined the Canadian Meteorological Service. I worked with a fellow who was a really nice teacher, Ted Mann, who was a coordinating author of one of the books prepared for the United Nations conference in 1972. Was called Inadvertent Climate Modification. And at that time, there were small little books that you could read. It was published by MIT Press. And the idea was that climate change had two legs. One, the greenhouse gases, and the second one is that as soon as you alter the surface, you immediately change the hydrological cycle from very small scale to larger scale. Well, that topic didn't progress very much after 1972, And many years later, I was confronted with a number of questions. I was working for the European Commission as an advisor. I had been nominated by the Canadian government, and I was helping out with the dispersion of atmospheric pollutants. And I got the question of, we're accumulating information to the extent that summer storms appear to be disappearing around the Mediterranean basin. Can we use all the experimental data we got from a number of European projects to try to find an explanation? So we worked on it, and fair enough, it came out a number of important points. First one of all is that when people think of the water resource of precipitation, they consider that it's a gift from the gods and you get the water, but that is not true. There are at least 3 components that contribute to precipitation in any one place. And as you move down to the mid latitudes, you find that you have 3 components. One comes from the oceanic evaporated water, which is what everybody thinks. There is a regional component. In the case of the Mediterranean Sea, water evaporated over the Mediterranean. And then there is a local component that is the one that governs, for instance, the presence or the development of storms. And the problem is that people normally think of the water resource as something that is given, and it's not the case. What we found is that if you change surface properties in places where the atmospheric circulations are limited, you stop contributing with the evaporation, and you increase the temperature of the air mass, and the result is that you lose storms. So this applies to a number of regions around the world. And once you trigger the changes, they propagate, they have threshold or tipping points, so that if you degrade the land past a certain level, the local precipitations disappear altogether. That's probably what happened in the Mideast and a number of other places. Once you desiccate the wetlands and you cut the trees and so on, eventually you turn into a desert, and it can be explained very well. It's a very, very uncomfortable truth, more than the greenhouse gases, because about the greenhouse gases, you can talk a lot and do nothing, but about land change, politicians don't want to hear that every time you build anything, you know, a highway or a school or a cement, whatever, you're altering the precipitation regime somewhere downwind from that area. And so that's work we have done, and it has been all published. Anyone wants to read through it. And that's it. The basic idea is that the systems are closed. They work normally at the watershed level. And before you make any land change use or any change of surface properties, you should know very well what the precipitation regime is in your watershed, because maybe what you're changing somewhere is altering the precipitation, say some 50 to 100 kilometers away. And once you know it, you can do something, including reforesting the watershed or whatever, to compensate the amount of water that you no longer evaporate once you build up or you seal the surface. I think that's it.
Okay. All right. Well, Dee Dee. Thank you, Mian.
I'm Dee Dee Purshouse, and the author of 2 books. One is called The Ecology of Care, and the subtitle, the impossibly long subtitle for that book, is Medicine, Agriculture, Money, and the Quiet Power of Human and Microbial Communities. And the other book is called Understanding Soil Health and Watershed Function. And I'm going to talk for a few minutes today about the soil sponge, which I like to talk about as the basic infrastructure that makes life on land possible. So I'm going to share my screen for a moment here. One sec. Technology. Okay. Here we go. So let's see here. Okay, slideshow. There we go. Okay. I've worked as a healthcare provider, an acupuncturist and holistic healthcare provider for 25 years in Vermont, and was thinking a lot about how our land supports our health in kind of direct terms. But during the last few years of my practice, we got hit by Hurricane Irene, and then increasingly more and more rainstorms that really started to change the landscape. So for example, just a couple years ago, this is the road right behind my house. And after a storm, this is what it looks like. And we're still paying the repairs of that. This is a town with just a few thousand people. So you can imagine the cost of repairing that when 75% of the roads in our town were damaged by that storm that didn't even have a name. You can see how that can add up quickly and kind of topple economies. And of course, around the world, we've got wildfires, we've got algae blooms, we've got desertification, et cetera, that are all basically a failure of the soil sponge. So one way to think of the soil sponge is that it's another word for healthy topsoil, which can go quite deep. And I have a demonstration that I like to do that kind of gets right down to the details here. And I do this with a simple plate of flour that is a stand-in for the sand, silt, and clay that is the mineral substrate of all soil. And if we were outside, I might blow on this to show you that when that sand, silt, and clay is not stuck together or aggregated into a soil sponge, wind erosion is a big issue, and we get soil that's blowing all the way across from one side of the world to the other, and that's happening quite a bit. But it also is impacted by water. And what I do for this demo, and I'm showing you so you can all do it the next time you're at a dinner party, take a cup, poke some holes in the bottom to make a little rain cloud, and let's see what happens when we rain on a landscape that does not have a soil sponge. So anyone who's done any baking knows that what happens when you put water onto flour is that the water is running off. It's not actually going in to this. And if this was a landscape, of course, this water is moving sideways rather than down into the landscape. And you can see it's creating a flood around the edges. A lot of erosion is happening. If this was a hilly landscape, we'd get mudslides. And of course, the water in this landscape now has got everything. It's got the soil in it, but it also has any chemicals that were being used on that soil or any nutrients going down into the lakes and streams and rivers. So what do we need to do to turn flour into bread, or to turn sand, silt, and clay into a soil sponge? We need to add biology. So in the case of bread, we're adding yeast, but in the case of soil, we are adding all of the biology that makes up a healthy topsoil. So once we've done that, all of those little particles have stuck together, and suddenly they have a structure, and that structure has structural integrity. So like a kitchen sponge, if you stuck it into water, it doesn't fall apart, but it also has porosity. And so when we rain on this landscape, something very different happens. So when we're raining on the soil sponge, it's soaking up the water. That water is getting down to the plant roots. even if this was a very sandy soil, actually the structure of this is going to hold that water at the level of the plant roots. So whether you start with a heavy clay soil or a sand soil, turning it into a sponge and creating that pore space and adding that organic matter and that life, it's going to make a big difference. Typically with this demonstration, I can add about 9 times as much water before it starts flooding at all. But the flood that happens is really different. The flood is coming out from the bottom. So this is refilling the springs, refilling the aquifers. It's being filtered as it moves through the landscape. It's being filtered both physically and biologically. And we can keep raining on this, and it's holding it in that in-soil reservoir for later use. And then it's very slowly evaporating and transpiring through the landscape to cool the landscape, which I know Walter will talk more about after. So I like to ask people, if you lived somewhere with just a little bit of rainfall, like where Neil is working, which landscape would you rather have around you? And I typically would say this one, the soil sponge. And if you lived somewhere with a lot of rain, like where I live in Vermont and where Judy lives, you'd still rather have this landscape. So in either case, we want the sponge. Okay, we're going to go back to the screen share for a moment. Okay. So this is what it looks like with actual soil. And these are trays that are open on the bottom, kind of like a big cookie cutter that's cut soil, all the same soil type, same ratio of sand, silt, and clay, but under different types of management. And on the far right, you can see that we've got these jars underneath that are catching the water that's been poured on this. So there's a rainfall simulator. And in the front, we've got the jars that are catching the runoff. So on the far right, you can see soil that's kind of like the flower. It has no aggregate structure. It's been managed under more conventional terms, so heavy tillage, a lot of inputs, no cover crop, and no animals integrated into the system. And you can see that no water is infiltrating. We put 4 inches of water on this soil, and it's nothing gotten down, even down 3 inches. And all of the water has run off, and it's taken a lot of the soil with it. So as we move over to the other side, more and more of the soil health principles are being put into effect. There's more and more biology working to create that soil sponge structure. And when you get over to the far side, you'll see that the water is all infiltrating, and it's being filtered as it goes down. Here's another way of looking at this is, this is a slake test, healthy soil on the right, unhealthy soil on the left. And you can see the structural integrity of the sponge, that you could leave this like this for 24 hours and that soil would not fall apart, even though it's immersed in water. Another way of testing it is doing a water infiltration test. So what does this mean in terms of a landscape? I'd like you to imagine standing with your bare feet on one side or the other of this picture. And on the right side, you can imagine that your feet would get very hot, but also the rest of your body would be hot, because the landscape on the left is cooling things through transpiration, through soil moisture, through what Professor Mian was talking about, that we have more water going down in and circulating on the left. And on the right side, what the solar energy is doing there is just evaporating that water. We also have more carbon going down in and creating the life in the land on the left and leaving the atmosphere on the right. And we have order being created on the left, so that CO2 is turning into life, that water is turning into life. And on the right side, we have more disorder. So one of our jobs in terms of getting the climate going in the right direction is taking disorder, so taking CO2, taking water that's flowing or water vapor, and turning it into life, into order, more and more ordered landscapes, because ordered landscapes know how to function. They create their own climate. So I like to talk about this as a biotic climate cycle, and Walter will talk more about that, I'm sure, that landscapes can create their own climates and rain versus an antibiotic climate cycle, that humans create their own deserts and droughts. So this gets back down to the soil sponge, and this is a close-up look at it. You can see the space in there. So how does this get created? Well, trees take CO2 and water, they turn it into themselves, and they turn it into food for all of life. And the carbon in this picture is in the air, in the soil, in the plants, and in the animals, and in the soil microbes. So when we talk about soil carbon, we're talking about the living, the dead, and the very dead in a landscape. Food for people, food for other species, and some of that life that gets created out of the landscape takes other life and starts rearranging it to influence the flows of water. And that happens both above ground and also below ground. So what's happening here is that when we looked at the bread, for example, is that in between those little rocks, there is life in those spaces that is pushing the rocks apart and sticking them together at the same time. And that creates this sacred space where water can flow, where air can flow, where life can access more nutrients. It's about life and light. That's how we start creating that sacred space. It's about the circle of life, continuing. And of course, cows are a very important piece of this for those of us who are interested in holistic land management, where we're creating the impact of wild herds on a landscape. And we can see the principles for creating a healthy landscape at work in a natural landscape. So keeping soil covered year round, minimizing stresses, maximizing photosynthesis, having diversity of plants and animals, planning with the whole water cycle in mind, and really understanding the context of the land. So the soil sponge is a basic infrastructure that makes life on land possible. Humans cannot build the soil sponge, only other species can. So which infrastructure are we going to spend our time and energy in rebuilding? This infrastructure or this infrastructure? I like to think of other species as the working class of the world. And how are we going to make their work visible, honor their work, collaborate with them, and step back to let them lead us into a better future? Thanks very much.
Thank you. I love it. It's like a bumper sticker, make carbon life again, you know? Yeah. All right, Walter, let's take it from there. Welcome. 3:30 in the morning, by the way, for those who didn't hear. He's in Australia. Walter, you're muted. Let's unmute you there.
I'm on mute.
There you go. You're good now.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Right. Look, well, greetings. Thank you very much, everybody. Look, as I introduced myself, I'm a soil microbiologist from down under, Australia. I've been in this game for about 50 years, very much working as a research scientist, looking at land systems and really what is the functioning of land systems. Australia is quite unique. It's the oldest sort of inhabited continent, the driest inhabited continent. And we've got some very, very old soils. And so the research is very much focused on, okay, what makes life possible in this very, very harsh environment? And when you come back down to all the basics, you're really looking at pedogenesis, the actual primary formation of soils. And really, how did then soils form? And they only formed 420 million years ago. Prior to that, we didn't have life on land, but it was actually the microbes breaking down mineral rock to make soils that allowed biosystems to be formed. And of course, with those biosystems, with those soils, we developed hydrology, and with that, the whole terrestrial biosystem and the terrestrial global hydrology and the global climate. So it's really fairly basic, but if you boil it all down, it's very naturally, of course, quite simple. Basically, the planet has been here for 4.6 billion years, and for over 4 billion years, we've had water covering most of its surface. And that water, through its basically unique heat properties, governs some 95% of the heat dynamics of this blue planet. And it's then a whole sequence of water processes that regulate and have regulated the Earth's climate, including through the natural greenhouse effect, which has warmed the Earth's surface 33 degrees centigrade, warmer than it would otherwise be. And of course, it's that warming through the natural greenhouse effect that's actually allowed us to keep water, liquid water on the planet, has allowed life to evolve, and of course, it makes Earth habitable and such a unique, special place. CO2 is also a component of that heat dynamics, but it represents less than 4% of that heat dynamics through its component of the greenhouse effect. But carbon and CO2, of course, is far more important in other ways, which we'll come on in a minute. But the bottom line is, it's a little bit like Professor Milone has explained, that we looked at climate change, and there are, exactly as he said, two legs to it, the greenhouse gases and the hydrological cycle. And exactly as he said, that it's basically our focus exclusively on just the greenhouse gases, and that 4% of the heat dynamics regulated by the CO2 greenhouse component, that's in a sense defocused us from the real facts, the fact that 95% of the heat dynamics is regulated by water. And of course, we have massively influenced the amount of water and those processes through our degradation of our land systems. So just as he says, as we change the land, we change the hydrology, and in that process, we change the heat dynamics of the blue planet. And then, of course, basically, we are responsible for that land management. And of course, politically, it's been very, very inconvenient to take responsibility. In the sense, we have to look at every land management change we make and say, what are the consequences, both in terms of its food production, its biosystem, its biodiversity, but now more profoundly, its climatic effects through changing the hydrology. Which comes back to Didi's discussion about the sponge. Obviously, 420 million years ago, when biology created soils and life on this land system, it did so by putting carbon from the air into the sponge. Okay, basically it's fungi and algae fixing carbon, and of course by growing through those soils and dying, leaving behind organic detritus that progressively create the sponge. Okay, and it's a drawdown of carbon from the air and its biosequestration into soil that creates the sponge. Every gram of carbon that we put into the soil as humus, it can hold some 8 grams of water. So we get this massive multiplier effect of water holding capacity, but it does more than that, as Didi demonstrated in the bread illustration. It creates a 3-dimensional matrix in that soil, and of course soil is, at least 1/2 voids, air spaces. So it's really the carbon sponge cementing together mineral particles to create these voids and matrices in soils. And of course, that is what then allows that soil to hold up to 20 times the weight of carbon as water. So it has a massive positive feedback multiplier effect. Effectively, the carbon sponge allows us to build cathedrals of voids and spaces and surfaces in soils. And that's really where life on land operates and is, in a sense, facilitating the productivity, the resilience of our biosystems. So it's these healthy, spongy soils that are really the key to our hydrology and, in a sense, restoring the climate. Now, basically, we'll go through that perhaps through the discussion, but we have done enormous damage to that soil structure across the planet. And in that process, we have totally changed the hydrology of the planet, and so totally its heat dynamics and capacity to buffer what is now intensifying a dangerous hydrological climate extremes, whether they're floods, hurricanes, aridification, droughts, wildfires. It's these extremes that in the next decades will actually fundamentally impact human societies and economies and collapse biosystems unless we rapidly, practically, naturally regenerate the Earth's soil carbon sponge. So as Dee Dee said, it's a sponge that is really our point of agency and tool. So carbon is important because we need to take that carbon from the air and not just simply draw it down in stable sinks, and that's valid, but we've got to go one step further. We've got to put that into the soil carbon sponge to rebuild the Earth's hydrology and therefore its stable heat dynamics. Now, basically, it's all relatively simple in terms of the science, the verified details, but as we go through the questions, I think we can elaborate them some further because while it's simple, there's a lot of detail in each of these processes that we are looking at. So wrapping it all up, it's basically that understanding of pedogenesis, soil formation, the critical importance of that sponge, which actually now gives us our only last chance to actually address and restore the heat balance of this Earth, our climate, our food production, the resilience of our biosystems, and our future. But let's widen the discussion, and then we can come back to some of those details as we go along. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Walter. Thank you.
Well, that's not easy to follow. You know what is this on, by the way? Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, it's just not like, yeah.
What I really want to spend my time focusing on is how simple things really are when we start to work on the right things. I'm really, really concerned that the mainstream environmental movement is really hitching our cart to the wrong horse. We're always talking about CO2 and greenhouse gases. And the reality is we're focusing on something that's invisible and that our actions cannot see immediate results. And so if we create carbon sucking machines, we won't even know for a couple of years if that's even starting to make any impact. And the people that really will feel that impact will be people decades from now, not the people today. And when you start to look at water and you start to really work with the watershed, you start to revive the health of soils, you start to infiltrate water into the landscape, you get something that's very actionable. The rise in temperature is not going to kill people. It's the watershed death spiral that is killing people right now. And that's something that's really important. You have to see these places where people used to have water year round, but because they cleared the forest, their springs are dry. And so now these people don't have water to drink. They're drinking out of mud holes. They're bringing it in from kilometers away in deep borehole wells, just making it all worse and worse and worse. Now, when you start to work with the water, when you start to respect and have reverence for water and life, everything magical just starts to happen. People see the results of their actions. The first rainy season, after the first monsoon, they can see that their actions delivered water for the dry season. They can see that their actions created more vegetation. It's not for logic that we're focusing on greenhouse gases. It's for convenience. It's very inconvenient to have to look at our land use practices and think, what is the impact in these areas? It's much more convenient to just push it to something external, invisible, that's one factor. And so we're simplifying the complexity of nature down to something that doesn't actually hold up in reality. But when humans start to work with water, you have to see these landscapes where I've been places where you're driving through a barren man-made desert, places that burn, places that don't receive precipitation that they used to because humans have changed the vegetative cover. Now, when humans really start working with the water, they really start infiltrating that into the soil, they start building the life of the soil, the diversity of the above ground vegetation, you're driving through those deserts and then you reach oases. You reach communities that are water self-sufficient in the most extreme landscapes you can imagine. And so when we start to reframe the narrative and really look at water as life, it's 70% of all life is water. And if we start to change our work, moving that into the 95% of the global heat dynamics versus focusing on the 4%, not only will it balance out all of these climate extremes, the different issues that we're having, but it actually enhances the quality of human life. It enhances what we can grow. It enhances the beauty of the places that we're in. It enhances the vitality. And it's not just for us that we're doing this work. It's for all living beings. It's for our brothers and sisters. And it's important for them that we start to reestablish the vegetation, reestablish the precipitation patterns, everything that all of these great people are talking about. If we start to focus on that as our implementation side versus policy and all these esoteric things that aren't actually going to improve human quality of life today, when you put more water in the ground, you improve human quality of life after the first rainy season. And so that's what we're really focused on. And we see all around the world, once people know what's possible, they don't just want to walk, they want to run in that direction. And so it's really important that we are effective communicators and that we share this story in a way that's easy for people to digest so that we can all group together and start to build this new narrative, a narrative of love and connection rather than separation, as Charles was saying.
Yeah. Neil.
All right, I'm back. First off, I want to say that it's a real honor to be on a panel with these folks. I've interacted with most of you to some degree. I was especially pleased we got to see initially a glimpse into Walter's bat cave. He's clearly moved, but it was great. And I'm really pleased. I've relied on a lot of people on this panel that we have a mix of storytellers and scientists and people with dirt under their fingernails. It's I've been deeply interested in these subjects since 2007, 2008. I started working on them professionally sometime in 2010. And my focus has been given the science that Didi and Walter and Professor Mian and Zach have told us. What's the best method for rapid expansion where that I can have as an individual? And so I've been in Saudi Arabia from 2010 to 2008, working on large-scale afforestation based on managing flash floods out of watersheds and then figuring out what are the results of that, both in terms of the social scale, in terms of the environment as well as in terms of economy. More and more we see that ecological degradation precedes poverty, and that poverty in turn tends to degrade more ecologies as a way to, to make ends meet. And so you have this really vicious cycle between people who have to meet their short-term needs at long-term expenses and don't have the luxury of even thinking about the long-term. And in the meantime, the externalities of that, the effects of that kind of affect us all. And then on the large scale, we have a failure in accounting to really tally up the costs of what the oil age has done to us and is doing to us, and to allocate those costs to the people who are imposing them. So at some point in the last 3 or 4 years, I decided that, or I observed that governments are a lagging structure when it comes to innovation and social change, at least democratic ones. Generally, democracies aren't going to make a move until all of the people have decided that it needs to go somewhere. And that means first you have to convince all the people that the country has to move in a certain direction. And that's an incredibly difficult and onerous and long-term kind of task. And so I decided that public office was not where I was going to make a difference, and forsook that path after considering it for a few years. In the meantime, where we see changes happening in markets all over the place is in entrepreneurship, where large changes have been adopted quite quickly by millions of people because of the power of markets. The other thought I have on that is that whatever we think the world should be, or how people should be, whatever the should is, people are what they are, and public opinion is what public opinion is, and we have to work with that, right? That's our starting point before we can start working towards whatever the should is. So I'm currently at Stanford Business School. I'm graduating in a month, and I'm fundraising for a number of projects. One in Baja, Mexico, one in Imperial Valley, California, one in Central Valley, California, one in the Sahel region where I may be working with UNDP Africa, one in Florida. And these are essentially either agroforestry programs or silvopasture programs that are vertically integrated and aim at launching consumer goods products that will create a financial flywheel for expansion onto hundreds of thousands of acres of land that we will regenerate through that engine of entrepreneurship and capitalism. What I have found in my work on the land is that when you create enough food for something, it shows up. I worked on really desolate, really barren stuff, where we averaged less than 2 inches of rain a year. We had no soil to start off with. And we saw through a change in management and trying to work with nature, we saw dramatic increases in the mycelial web, in tree cover, in insect populations, in bird populations, in lizard populations. And that's fantastic if you can make it happen. But unless you can combine that with an incentive for the people to manage that system as such, eventually it's going to be subject to the short-term needs of people who see that as a resource to be exploited rather than as a cycle to cooperate with. And so whatever we're doing, there has to be a strong economic component that's going to align with people's incentives to manage that as an ecology. rather than to exploit it as a short-term gain. And that's what I'm trying to create. That's what I'm all about.
Thank you, Neil.
Okay.
Minnie.
Right. Hi, I'm Minnie, and I'm speaking to you from the United Kingdom. The time here is 7:30 in the evening, and it was a lovely sunny day today. As opposed to the Easter weekend, which was 2 weekends ago, where we had a heat wave, today was extremely cold. So no longer are we able to tell whether we're going to have what kind of temperatures we're going to have. And that's representative of what's happening around the world. So one of the NGO we run is called the Flow Partnership. And we started this in 2011 to work with some of the poorest communities in the world. It actually started with a conversation with Rajendra Singh, who is there with you in the conference at the moment, and seeing the work that he'd been doing and some of the tremendously successful stories coming out from some of the poorest and driest regions of India. How did that happen? It answers that fundamental question that Walter asked. What is the basis of life? I mean, water is the basis of all life. So if we are talking of the sponge that you're talking about, Didi, you need water to create that sponge. And what is it that communities did before that had that did not, landscapes across the world were not as degraded as they are today? Why is this degradation of landscapes accelerating today? And that's a question we've been asking a lot with the various different communities we've been working with, whether it's in India or it's in Europe or even here in the UK. In India, we're working with communities that are facing drought. In the UK, we're working with communities that are facing floods. And two things come out to us. One is that slowly, over a period of time, governments have been taking on more and more upon themselves to do the work of landscape management. So slowly, communities either are losing the wisdom and the knowledge that they had about managing their landscape, or they're becoming lazy. The government will do it. We don't really need to do very much, or they're not allowed to. So that's one part of the equation. The other side is in very, very poor areas. There is a lot of migration because of no water, because of a drought situation. People leave their land and go. And when they land up in a city, they're completely disconnected from the land. And the next generation has no understanding of what to do with the land. So a lot of our work started with how do you bring back that wisdom that people knew, that they resonate with. The science is great. There's plenty of science around. A lot of scientists come with fantastic knowledge and information, which a lot of people whose basic concern is 2 meals a day, which they're not getting because of the lack of water on their land, they don't hear. So how do we bring the two together? That's a huge question. If we really want to make a difference to accelerate the pace of change and regenerate green landscapes, reconnect people to the local water cycle, to hold the water where it falls, what is it that we need to do that will accelerate this? And the answer to us came very clearly that there has to be some agency which is given back to communities. If we have community-driven, decentralized water management, to a large extent, we are working with people with what they know. People who live on the land know a lot of the science around it. Often they can't read and write, so they can't communicate it in a paper, but they know what they need to do. If we can empower and enable people to do more of what they already know, that's where we feel we've seen success and change beginning to happen. So earlier, Zach was talking about having seen a lot of land and landscapes which they had been very dry before, and now they can change within not even a year, in less than a year. If communities, especially if you look at dry, arid Rajasthan, where Rajendra is from, and where we're doing a lot of work, if they build a traditional water body, which takes less than a month to build, which used to be part of their history, which used to be part of their tradition, their culture, their understanding of their connection with all the three cycles, the hydrological, the atmospheric, the stratospheric. They knew all that. And if they build that water body, which their ancestors knew and now they no longer do, reviving that tradition, in less than a month, you have a structure that holds the water. And if you do it in a staggered fashion, a river gets revived. As soon as the monsoon comes, the water body fills up and it holds the water. So instead of the water running away, there is water on the land, instantly creating a soil sponge and all the various diversity that needs to be created. Over a period of time, the entire catchment revives. So how can we amplify this and make communities more and more self-empowered to do this kind of work? The other thing that comes out to us is sometimes when we go to communities in slightly less poorer areas, they often say things like, you know, I planted this particular crop this year because last year the rain was so much. And it was completely the wrong crop to plant. I wish I'd known how much rain might fall this year or how much water there was in the land, then I would have planted a different crop. And that's where we feel is the bridge between science, what science knows, and what communities know. And somewhere, if we can create a very strong bridge between the two, where each informs the other, the pace of change and the number of people that will be engaged in this work will increase. That's a lot of the work we do. How do we create this amplification? How do we enable more and more people to understand this work or to do it? Are there methods that people can exchange across the world? We are setting up a water school with language neutral tools. It's in the process. How can we make this available across the world? So I feel that's a lot of the work that we do, and I'm going to leave it over here for questions and discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you. And I realize we keep saying Minnie, but Minnie Jain, is that how you pronounce your last name, Minnie?
Yes, it's Minnie Jain.
Jain, yeah, great. Thank you. All right, Judith.
Hi, everyone.
Judy.
Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't see my little box. Yeah, all of this is a real lot to take in, and it's such an honor to be part of this group. And so many of you are and have been my teachers, and I've interviewed many of you and written about your work in previous books, my book in progress. Actually, I'll mention the book in progress. It's called Restoration Flash Mob, The Curious Person's Guide to Earth Repair. So yeah, like let's do it. And all this work that, you know, that all of you have mentioned, so many people don't know that restoration of our landscapes is possible. So let's get that word out there. And a couple of thoughts, you know, just in response to what I've heard just now about shifts that we need to make. One shift is in terms of our heart or our consciousness, and one is about collectively our way of thinking. So to paraphrase what Tim began with, which was how often the approach to dealing with a problem is what do we need to attack? Who's the enemy? So if we could, and Tim, so this is paraphrasing Tim, and who in turn was paraphrasing Charles, if we could turn this around to what's out there that we can nurture, that would be a really good way to go. And then in terms of how our thinking is, so we've been hearing about degraded landscapes. Dee Dee had some photographs. I think, you know, we all know what this looks like in terms of, you know, Dee Dee shared the photograph of post-flood landscapes and a desertified landscape. So many people would see these images in the news or descriptions of these in news reports and think, this is a result of climate change. And the immediate response is disempowerment, sadness, grief, helplessness. But if we start to understand and make this shift to understand that these are also the causes of climate change, that the desertified landscape where the water is evaporating or flooding and removing topsoil, where you're losing the carbon because the soil is uncovered and it's oxidizing, and all of understanding these dynamics, which are, you know, as Walter says, is pretty simple. That once we understand that that's a cause of climate change, then we can begin to address these landscapes and be more empowered and include others in this work. So yeah, those are a couple of shifts. So what is on my mind right now, aside from the book, which I have only 1.5 chapters left. And in this book, I had Zach over to our house. I did a workshop with Didi. I interviewed Mian in Spain, and where Mian, I mean, no one can read clouds like Mian. I mean, he would look up in the sky and say, okay, so the clouds are moving in this direction. It's going to rain in 1 hour. And then lo and behold, it rains in an hour. Anyway, and then also yes. I interviewed Neil, and I'm really excited about his work too. So, but what's also on my mind right now, I don't know if you all have talked about this, the report from the intergovernment, let me see if I get this right, the intergovernment science platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services. It's the IPBES report. And they haven't done one for 14 years. I'm not sure exactly why, but you're starting to see news reports, just, you know, again, often these, you know, pictures of devastation and all about the biodiversity losses and, you know, insect Armageddon, all these losses and the loss of ecosystem function. And one reason I have this on my mind is I'm going to be interviewed by the BBC World TV tomorrow morning, right when this comes out. So it's early, it's 8 a.m. here in Vermont. You know, and that's really daunting. It's daunting because just to even grapple with some of the conclusions that are in this report is just, you know, like a lot to take in. But what's striking is where I see some positive is that no longer, so that there's this bringing together of understanding. The way people are talking about it isn't that climate is over here and biodiversity is over here, and we have to kind of, you know, deal with one and then deal with the other. That there's a growing understanding in these institutions and in the that's shared in the communication, that these are very much tied together. Because one thing that I've just, you know, been struck by, and this is something I want to bring up, is that in terms of climate change, one thing that has been left out of the discussion is the role of functioning ecosystems in climate regulation. So this is an opportunity to really bring this home. So yeah, there we go. So I'm going to leave it there and we can chat and we'll, yeah, I'll hear people's questions and we'll, you know, work through this.
Great. Thank you. Good job.
Yeah. Boy, this thing's not working so well. Usually,
it's okay. It's fine.
I'm in the position of if I'm on some kind of climate panel or on some kind of conference about climate, I'm in the position of saying, hold on, guys, we're putting way too much emphasis on emissions and fossil fuels and warming. Let's pay attention to these other things. And here, like, everybody's singing my song. So I feel really good about that. I could pick up on so much of what's been said. When I was researching my book, which is called Climate, A New Story, I was developing the living Earth hypothesis that says that the climate is a function of a living organism, its physiology. So I looked up on, I did what passes for research in my world. I went on to Google and I was like, okay, effect of biodiversity on climate, because I'm sure that biodiversity must maintain climate. And the first 10 pages of results were the opposite of my search. It was how climate affects biodiversity. Same thing for soil erosion. How does soil erosion affect climate? And all of the results, even though I put it that way, all the results were how does climate affect soil erosion? So this is the pattern of that you were referring to at the beginning, like find the enemy, find the bad guy, find the one cause, the reductionistic one cause that then allows us to solve every problem. So this reductionism, it fits very comfortably into the policy establishment. It lends itself easily to centralized solutions, but it also, as Zach was saying, makes the solutions very abstract in terms of space and time. It makes it somebody else's responsibility. So I think that we're just barely beginning to understand how this planet actually works and the role of life in maintaining climate. You know, climate, when people used to talk about climate, they spoke of a hot climate or a cold climate, but they just as often spoke of a wet climate or a dry climate. So when we say climate change is affecting rainfall patterns, we should actually be saying the changing rainfall patterns, that is climate change. That's not a result of climate change. All the time, you know, if you read a news article on emissions, carbon or something, they'll have a photograph of like this cracked field, you know that photograph, right? You've seen it all the time. That is actually not caused by global warming. But the implication is that it is. So the implication, who benefits from this? In fact, the fossil fuel companies are fine with the standard narrative of climate change, and they are investing heavily in biofuels, plantations, and carbon sequestration, carbon capture technologies, and geoengineering. So you got to look at where the money's going and who gets empowered by which narrative. So the water narrative, that's not, I mean, you could say, well, okay, if we're going to talk about one substance, let it be water, not carbon. But water is very different. It's not globally more or less evenly distributed. It doesn't lend itself very easily to modeling. And the way to restore water depends on 1 million and 1 billion global, local place-based solutions that involve not just humans, but all life. So yeah, this is all contributing to a larger paradigm shift that I'm just so happy that everybody in this, all of you guys are doing this work.
Great. What is it? Great. Let's do after. They were saying if you haven't returned your keys, that's a thing. So leave right now and go return your key. Okay. Thanks, Lily. Okay. Sorry to lose you, my friend. We'll see you soon. So I'm going to start with a question online, and then, because I imagine once we go here, we'll be doing this for a minute, and then maybe we'll get another one online, but we'll see. Because we have folks chiming in from California, the Netherlands, Estonia, Spain, Sweden, all over the world. So I'm going to take a question from Basil Camus. Walter and Didi, Thank you so much for your amazing contributions. Question, where should we focus our efforts? On planting trees or restoring soil biology? Which is more important? Are they equal? And what is the role of urban landscapes in all of this, as separate from big agriculture, logging, etc.? Can changes in the urban landscape help to fix the planet, assuming agriculture continues to ignore these issues? Sorry for what ended up being a very long question. Thank you. Thank you, Basil. Basil. So Walter, are you muted? Oh, you're muted. Hang on, Walter. Let's unmute you. There you go.
Right. Thank you very much. Look, the question is, where do we start? What do we do? And it's very simple. It's all of the above. Yes, we have to, in a sense, plant a tree to restore the soil carbon, but it's even simpler than that. Look, let's just go back to, again, petagenesis, how the actual land was formed, the biosystems were formed. It was simply a matter of plants, a plant drawing down carbon, sequestering that in its soil to create the sponge, to create the hydrology, and that hydrology actually created and maintained a cooler, moister climate habitat in which we could live. So yes, we have to actually increase the amount of green photosynthesis, the carbon drawdown, and basically that we can do by growing trees, by growing urban agriculture, by all sorts of just increasing green. But it's not just a matter of increasing photosynthesis, then it's a question of making sure that every gram of carbon that is fixed is actually sequestered into soils rather than oxidized back into CO2. Okay, it's not that every gram has to, but it's just the balance between how much is oxidized back to CO2 and how much is sequestered. And Charles Keeling showed us that elegantly 50 years ago in that whole basic climate CO2 curve, because every year we, through our oxidative activity, emit some 130 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere. And every year our residual green biosystems draw down about 120 billion tons of carbon a year. And of course, we've got a 10 billion tons deficit, which is why Charles Keeling showed us the CO2 is going up. Okay, and of course, fossil fuel use represents about 8 of that 130 billion tons of carbon emissions. So we've got to understand it's a small fraction of the total, but we influence that 130 billion tons totally through wildfires, through oxidation, through our desertification of landscapes, through that whole degradation of landscapes. So the CO2 rise needs to be not seen as something negative. It is just an imbalance between our emissions and drawdown. The CO2 rise is simply the symptom of our irresponsible land degradation and land management. Okay, and the CO2 in the air is actually the resource that we can readily capture to rebuild these biosystems, to rebuild this hydrology, to rebuild the Earth's cooling. Okay, and we do that, as you ask in the question, simply by growing more plants and keeping that carbon in the soil. There's very, very elegant, simple, natural processes to do that. We just change our management in very subtle ways, and we can do that. I mean, plants, the maximum can biosequester up to 200 tons of carbon per hectare per annum. You know, this is water hyacinths in the Fly River in Papua New Guinea or water hyacinths in sewage ponds in Alabama. But it doesn't matter if you're doing 200 tons. Of course, most of us can't. Even if we're doing 2 tons carbon per hectare per annum, it's making sure that that carbon goes into the sponge to rebuild the hydrology, to rebuild that hydrological buffering. And so, yes, we have to increase the amount of green. We have to increase how much of that carbon that is fixed stays and is put into soils. And we've got to restore that natural hydrological cooling cycle. And again, it's very, very simple. Okay, we have, through global warming, we have increased the retention of heat on this planet by some 3 watts per square meter on average. And yet the natural hydrology of this planet every day retransmits 342 watts per square meter back out to space. So nature does over 100 times the cooling that our abnormal warming has caused us. So again, all we have to do is change the hydrology 1%, restore 1% of that natural cooling, and we can actually address global warming. We can restabilize biosystems, biodiversity, re-empower communities. So it's 1% correction that we can do naturally through this hydrological restoration. As Milan says, we can do that within days, right? Because as a cloud forms, a cloud cools. As rainfall comes, it cools. We can restore this cooling within days. It will take centuries to just simply draw down enough CO2 with any hope of changing the climate through just CO2 emission reduction or drawdown. So all the tools are there, and it's just a matter of opening our minds and looking at, well, what are the processes in nature? How have we affected them? What do we need to get our boot off Mother Nature's throat and let them be restored, and then rebuild healthy communities, healthy biosystems, and healthy futures?
Yeah, thank you.
I'll take a crack at the question as well.
Yeah.
So in terms of whether to plant trees or to work on soil biology and grow the sponge, as Walter said, both, but a little bit more specifically, I would say, in the spirit of something I've heard Charles say, do the thing that you love. So do the thing that calls to you, but also do what's appropriate for the landscape around you. I'm hearing feedback. Is there maybe there's somebody not muted? Okay. So, and also to think in whole landscape. So whenever we start to ask questions like, should I do this or that? We're probably asking the wrong question. And one of the things we work on at the Soil Carbon Coalition, which is the nonprofit I work with, and the Land and Leadership Initiative, which is the school that we've started, is asking better questions and then getting more people engaged in both asking and answering those questions. So when we start to think in whole landscapes, and also start to think in the context of where we are in space. If are we in a place that is boreal forest that's been plowed under, or are we in a place that's a grassland? In Vermont, I hear people complaining that that meadows are growing back into forests, but that's what wants to grow here. So the other question is, what can grow? So Walter often talks about this petagenesis and also the sequential growing of a landscape, and it starts with lichen. So if lichen is what can grow, let the lichen grow, right? Because lichen is going to bring in the next thing, and then that's going to bring in the next thing. So what we call weeds are often the first responders. So the weeds tell us the state of the soil sponge or the lack thereof. And so Nicole Masters talks about reading your weeds. So if you see something growing that you think doesn't belong there, it's telling you the state of the soil. it's actually helping to heal the soil. So we get things like Japanese knotweed growing here in Vermont, and people are worried about it, but it's huge, big, leafy vegetation with deep, pumping lots of carbon back into the soil, feeding lots of things underground. And it happens to also be one of the best medicines for Lyme disease, which is, Vermont is one of the worst places in the world for that. So, so before we decide what's right for the land, let's look at the land and see what is the land telling us it needs. I was at a really wonderful conference in Montreal recently, the Living Soil Symposium, and there was a native man there who said, I'm getting really frustrated with all of this talk about how to measure carbon in soils or how to measure water infiltration, because indigenous people can tell you the structure of the soil, can tell you how much water is in the landscape simply by looking at the plants that are growing. So I would really encourage us to take that a little bit more of a whole systems and observer approach to see what's happening and what's needed, and not to assume that we know best. And then the last piece is really what are your aims? When you think about benefiting all of life, we want landscapes that invite in all of life, that create habitat and food and water for all of life. So thinking about that and not just planning for our own best interest when we're working on restoring a landscape, whether it's a rooftop garden in New York City, or whether it's a vast tract of what used to be wilderness in Alberta, Canada. We need to think about everybody who might have wanted or might in the future want to live there, from microbes all the way up to humans. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Dee Dee. And then just unmuted me on, because I realize once we go here, we're not going online questions again, probably, because I'll be moving around. But tying into this question real quick, and I unmuted you, Professor Mion, because this questioner, Benjamin Jansen, mentioned you, and tying in, because we're talking trees, soil, there's grasslands, what does the land want to be? And I appreciate Benjamin asking about the meteorological role of wetlands in temperate regions. Can you, because we talk a lot about trees and soil and
well, let me talk
not a lot about what Babylon first did, which was drain the wetlands to make dry land, So wetlands, Professor Mion.
Let's first talk about the water cycle, which is always forgotten, including today, is that you evaporate water in one place and you dump it in another. In the tropical forest, the precipitation in any one day, 65% comes from the precipitation in the 3 previous days. And that is observed locally. Of course, if you get 2,000 liters per square meter per year, and the fellow looks at the river, it looks like it's only getting 35% of that. So the politician will cut the trees because he considers that the trees are using up his water. And as soon as you cut the trees, it stops raining. The point is that you have to know where you evaporate the water and where it precipitates, because the natural system will tend to equilibrate the amount of water it gets, but it depends on the watershed. It's not the same all over the world. So if you deforest the coast in the Mediterranean, you stop the precipitation 100 kilometers inland, and eventually you run out of water in the aquifer. And you'll think that you're having water shortage or something like that, when actually you have caused a problem by sealing the soil along the beach. And unless you take that into account, you're not going to recover anything, because you can plant all the trees you want. If you don't have the right precipitation, you cannot maintain them. The idea is that you have to know watershed by watershed, what are the inputs and what are the outputs, and consider that when you have, let's say, 20 inches of water per square meter, let's put an example, you don't get 20 inches of water. You get 1 inch of water per precipitation event times 10 precipitation events per year. And you have to make sure that that water keeps going around and around, and that you see a lot of water. Actually, you see the same amount of water many times. And it's the vegetation that and the soil that keeps that going. I had a invited conference for the European Commission, and the title of my conference was Water Begets Water and Vegetation is a Midwife. Okay, that was a short title. The original title was Water Begets Water, Soil is a Womb, and Vegetation is a Midwife. But the idea was that you had to evaporate to get the water within a certain watershed. You have to take into account where the water is evaporated and where the water is precipitated, and what components come from where. I mean, everyone seems to think that the water is evaporated over the seas and over the oceans and it precipitates. That's not true. In inland areas, the water is evaporated locally and you precipitate locally. And it's the soil and the vegetation that provide that amount of recycling. You get rid of the soil and or vegetation or both, and all of a sudden the rain stops and you have a desert.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't know if that's your...
And also I've heard you mention about wetlands before, and how the evapotranspiration that comes off of wetlands in areas that were wet. So the soil that's saturated by water is also a womb. And then you get that evapotranspiration. I've heard you mention deforestation and wetland draining on the Valencia coast.
Yeah, but the wetlands around the Mediterranean was totally surrounded by wetlands in the time of the Romans. And the precipitation at the time was of the order of 2,000 liters per square meter per year. Sorry, I had to use my metric units. Okay, in some of those areas, the precipitation is now less than 400 liters per square meter per year. The wetlands were maintained because they evaporated water that acted as a trigger component for the storms to take place 100 kilometers inland, and the aquifer fed the same marshes. Okay, so it was the same water that was going around with cycles that may last years or may last just 1 week or 1 day. And you have to get the connection between the marshland along the coast and what is feeding that marshland normally is an aquifer. And where does that aquifer get the water, which is up in the mountains, you know, up in the headwaters of the aquifer. And make sure that you don't change anything in one place that alters the conditions along that recycling path. I don't know if I...
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Thank you. All right, we're gonna take some questions from here now. We're gonna take this mic with a cord. Our wireless mic didn't function, and then it's gonna be a team effort. We'll see how far we can get. And if we need to, I'm gonna take this off like I did the other days and walk around to you. But is it stuck? Yeah, if you could free it up, that might be here. Why don't we pass it around? Here, I'll pass it to you. Go under. Wait, through here. Through here. There you go. All right. Okay. I see. Let's get down. Excuse me.
Hi there, Libby Roderick from Alaska. So deeply appreciative of this. So I'm from Alaska, and I generally don't really have conversations about restoration. We are basically still engaged in protection. And so very little of this kind of conversation ever happens. But it's interesting listening to other folks and seeing that they seem to be as surprised by this information as I am. So anyways, this is probably the most interesting conversation I've had. I've been doing climate work for 30 years. And so, the obvious question seems to be how to quickly get this information out to as many people as possible, as rapidly as possible. So I'm just indulge me for a second, just making little notes to myself. Like, so on the one hand, it seems incredibly simple, as people have said, and on the other, there are complexities, as there always are in ecosystems. But I'm thinking about the need quickly for a meme that people can quickly grasp to shift the game from the constant conversation about carbon to this new way of framing it, so that people, every person in this room, could push it out rapidly on social media and begin to have new conversations with people who are losing hope, at least where I come from, very rapidly. So that's one thought I'm having. Another thought has to do with, I mean, this webinar, this specific session, I have a big reach myself. I'm sure many people do, right? That the most important thing we can do is work with the networks that we have as the center of that universe and move things quickly. And I know that it's tough sometimes to get free access to things, but we must these days. We must get free access.
This is free on YouTube.
Okay, cool.
It's live right now, and in 20 minutes after, it'll be up for anybody for free.
That's fantastic. Yeah. So that every person in this room can have a dinner party, or they take it to their classrooms, or whatever access that you have.
It's on the Global Ecosystem the Global Earth Repair Conference YouTube channel.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm thinking about open educational resources. I'm sure some of you know about that, sort of the Creative Commons of the educational world, and ways to make sure this moves quickly so that people who teach can have access to this kind of information. I'm thinking also about, I used to say from the stage a lot, there was a story about these folks many, many years ago who were all working in nuclear weapons. They really wanted to get out of it. They couldn't figure out how to do it. They formed a support group, and it was gentlemen, as each new fellow went out to find a new job, the other 5 pooled their incomes to support them and their families until they found a new job, and then cycled back through to do it, right? And the reason I'm saying this is because I imagine, I don't know many of you people, how you make your livings, but we need to make sure people who need to make a living can give this information away for free rapidly, right? So I don't want to take any more time, except that I think those conversations need to happen. They need to happen today, and figure out ways to move it out quickly.
Thank you so much. Anyone on our panelist? Yeah. Okay. Minnie, Zach just called you. Oh, you're muted. Minnie, you want to unmute your?
Yeah, hi. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. What was the question?
Take the mic.
I think I could give just a brief intro to what you're doing with the flow. So the question was, how do we reach the maximum amount of people? And you bring up a very good point that it does need to be free, because this needs to be in the hands of the peasant farmers around the world. And so I'll let Minnie take it from here, but they're starting a water school that will be free with the intention of reaching these people that, one, have the most direct ties to the land, but 2, are the most directly impacted by the degradation.
But also the people here, the rich people, our people really need this quickly.
Yeah.
Don't get it any other way.
We're doing our best. I mean, we're trying, every single one of us on this panel is like trying to broadcast it. I mean, that's why I wrote a freaking book, you know. You know, and I mean, I'm going to put this seminar, I'm going to put this out there as much as I can. I mean, I'm just happy. Like, I'm kind of shocked that you were shocked at or surprised by this information. You know, yeah, like it gets drowned out in the despair narrative of the conventional climate change narrative.
Well, but it's also that the actual information, the literal just 94% of it's over here compared to 4% of it over there. I mean, just some of the very fundamental things that if we could condense them, I mean it, into a simple meme that could get pushed out on Facebook and all the other things people are up to.
There's the new water paradigm guys, the Slovakian guys.
Yeah, Rain for Climate.
Rain for Climate.
Yeah.
Climate is doing a lot of that. I've been working on a documentary to basically wrap this story into a 15 to 20 minute film that can be shared on YouTube. There's a lot of people doing work, and I think we're just starting to gain momentum and energy.
Gotcha.
We couldn't fit them on the panel, but
I would like to say something about social media. It's been my experience that attention span on social media is a fraction of a second. So
or shorter.
The next thing comes and the next thing comes. So if you really want a very strong conversation about these issues that matter, it begins with you, your community and your networks, and consistent, persistent conversation. So it's not a 1 second meme alone that'll do it. It is persisting in having this conversation with your community consistently. And I think that's what will make the change. So a community at a time, and your being true to this conversation will change the narrative back to what we really need to focus on, which is the water in our communities and bringing the local water cycle back, which, as Professor Millenia said, and which Mikhail Krasik, who is the hydrologist in Slovakia, who wrote the New Water Paradigm, brings out, and which we've proven again and again with communities. There is deforestation and where there is drought, if the trees come back, the local water cycle begins to come back. Immediately you see the difference. So that conversation needs to be had consistently. And as Zach is saying, there are many, many initiatives that are now beginning to gain momentum. So the water school we are planning will be a global water school. It will have methods that communities across the globe are using, whether they're educated, uneducated, in a remote corner. We're trying to see how we can make them available in language neutral format. And they will always, these methods will always be free to the end user. Half the problem is that often these methods or whatever is known around this work is charged. And if you want the world to take it on, you cannot charge for this. This is for the earth. If we want people to be able to take care, to love the earth, to repair what we've done, the damage we've done, then we need to know what to do. And that's the kind of conversation we need to have, not a commercial conversation. It's not a commercial conversation. There is no cost. It's priceless, the care and the conversation we give to earth repair. And that's what your conference is about. And that's how it'll move further.
Let me just say also, I mean, I've thought in the past about trying to find people who have deep pockets. And there are people, I think, in a town like this connected to people who do, that can sponsor ads on television. I used to think about this using marketing tools to try to get messages out about peace. This is a very fundamental piece of information that people do not have. And even a 30-second piece, you watch the NFL games or something and somebody makes this link for people. I'm not joking. I'm quite serious. That kind of thing, or talking about when we have these conversations about the Green New Deal, if people are at these conversations of how to make major resource investments in some way of shifting the game. One of the ways to shift the game is to have a Green New Deal where, just like we had in the New Deal, but people go out and do what you are talking about, right? When the fellow who was speaking, Liu, was talking about talking to the military, not a joke. If the military could start moving on this as a national security issue, which it is, then you unleash vast amounts of resources to move.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that you brought up the Green New Deal, because I look at that as something that could hold so much potential, but everything that I hear about it, it's all focused around the technological solutions that we can do that don't really address any of our real problems. And so if we modeled the Green New Deal after the New Deal, one of the most effective pieces of legislation where we put a huge amount of the population to work, creating water bodies, creating terraces, reforesting, building infrastructure we still use today, and we stopped the Dust Bowl. We ushered in one of the most productive periods in American history. And we need to, it's not technology that's going to get us where we're trying to go, it's nature. Yeah. Nature has all the technology that we need to solve all the world's problems.
I wanted to jump in with one other thing in terms of a free resource. The second book that I mentioned, the Understanding Soil Health and Watershed Function, I spent about a year writing that so that there would be a facilitator's manual that people can take into schools and into their own communities and their own projects, with demonstrations like the bread and flour, with conversations you can have around that fence line photo and various other things that you can do out in the land. It's available as a free download. It's 150 pages. You can find it either at my website, ddpurshouse.com, or at soilcarboncoalition.org/learn. And I want to say also, don't underestimate what a project like that can do, because I wrote that with an intention for it to be used in schools in the United States. And in just under a year, it's been downloaded by projects, farms, universities in 50 different countries and half of the United States states. And the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization just got in touch saying they want me to come train the trainers for the Farmer Field School program in India, which is impacting just in that one state, 500,000 farmers this year, and they expect 1 million farmers next year. And that's all over the world. So, and here I am, I'm, 5 years ago, I was an acupuncturist. I didn't go back to school to get a degree. I started trying to take the messages from that I'm hearing from scientists and translate them into memes, into demonstrations, into things that you can use to get this communication across to the general public, to farmers, to ranchers, to people without resources. So you can do the same kind of thing. It's just a matter of setting an aim and make it big and get to work, write it. I had to write 1 million little stupid grants for $5,000 each or $1,000 each. And it's a doable thing. We're all going to have to do our version of that if we want this to go big fast. But I think translating science into language that is more easily accessible is a big piece of what's needed. And I totally agree that little 1-minute memes, little videos are really important. I think Kiss the Ground has done a great job with that with their soil story video. We're hoping to get something like that together with the soil sponge over the next few months. But this is something for all of us to participate in. And one last thing I think that's really key here is when we do create these memes, one of the things that I find most hopeful in the United States is seeing how very conservative Christian groups and very liberal kind of more permaculture coastal groups are coming together around a single aim through this narrative about soil health and water. And I purposefully in my materials, I kept the word climate change out. I even didn't really talk much about soil carbon because I wanted it to be something that people could take and use together without having to get into that conversation. And that's one of the beautiful things about the soil sponge narrative, is that it can unite a lot of different groups around a single aim. And we saw that happen in New Mexico, the recent soil act that just passed. Building consensus and working towards the soil health principles rather than looking at this as a climate fix. So I would encourage people to think about what is the common language that we can use that brings people together. And I think water is a key piece of that. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to say one more the thing is that Sir David Attenborough in the UK, some time ago, there was a film that was screened on primetime television called The Blue Planet. And it was a beautiful documentary about what a beautiful blue planet we live in. But the one image of that which went viral and which actually has changed the behavior of almost, I would say, 90+% British people is the image of a plastic straw stuck up the nostrils of a beautiful turtle in the sea. And that's immediately everybody connected to the fact that we use a straw in our daily lives. It's a plastic straw. It ends up in the ocean, and look what it does to our beautiful blue planet. Something like that, which connects you in water with our water usage in our daily lives, is an action that people can take, is likely to change behavior very quickly. And so if we can think of things like that, which are culturally what we as a culture in the US or the UK do and connect it to our daily lives, that is something that can go viral. Otherwise, it becomes a conversation where we know we need to change behavior, and yet we don't have enough of the numbers. We don't know what to do. We still go in the gray area. Oh my God, the world's in a terrible state. We're using too much water. We shouldn't be using. All those questions, they just swirl around, but we don't know what action to take. Us who are interested in this topic might, but in our daily lives, people in the day, what is the action they can take? How can that be communicated at a national level?
Great.
Can I add one thing to the topic of messaging? Because the climate conversation is extremely highly polarized, I think that we have to be really careful about subordinating the soil and water issue to greenhouse gases. Because for one thing, we alienate half the population, at least in America, that doesn't even believe in global warming. Secondly, because it's not actually about that. So like Zach was saying, to hitch our wagon to the greenhouse gas horse we could end up regretting that. And because you put the stuff out there, and like I can imagine at the climate conference I was just at Findhorn, I can imagine someone listening to Professor Mian and be like, oh, hold on, which side are you on? Which side are you on? Like, that's the first question when anyone is presented with something a little bit unfamiliar. They're like, okay, let me decide which side you're on. And I think that it's good to evade being placed on one side or another, because when you're identified with one of the sides, you are reinforcing the paradigm that holds this particular debate to be what we should be talking about. So we're validating the wrong paradigm by piggybacking on greenhouse gas alarmism. And that's controversial, but I said it.
And to build on that, I see huge potential here for a bridge issue. Right now, as you say, you have these two sides. Everyone's just trying to arouse frothing hatred for the other. And in this new story is a lot of shared human values. So let's look at the people on the other side that we think of as the enemy. Let's find our shared values, and then let's build that world together.
Let's get on. Let's go to the other side there. I'm going to walk over to you with this mic because that one's not going to reach.
Okay, is that loud enough? Is that good? Okay. So the issue that I'm having with this, none of this information is really a surprise to me. The percentage I wasn't aware of. But to me, it sounds like it could become yet another my issue is more important than your issue thing. And also could be interpreted as and used as an excuse not to make the other changes. Like, as an individual, I'm probably not going to go somewhere else and help restore ecosystems. I do my best in my yard, my garden. I catch rainwater, I do humanure. I don't wash dishes, I lick them. And there are all those things. And I rarely drive. I ride my bike and take the bus, and I don't eat meat. And it just seems to me that as individuals who aren't going to go around the world and help restore other places, that still what we all, I think, should be doing is using less, including fossil fuels and water especially, and buying less stuff because, well, for one, the fossil fuels, it's the demand for people using them. I mean, not just individuals, of course, but that's devastating landscapes, right? Mountaintop removal to get the coal, et cetera, and devastating communities where they drill for oil. And you know, the water, the excess water use causing the dams. So I don't know, I think that all of those things are important, and I'm just kind of concerned that, you know, this kind of change of focus could make people think I don't need to make any of these other changes. So I'd like to hear something about that. Thank you.
Which of our panelists has something to say about that?
I have something to say, but it may be controversial.
All right, well, who's next? Anybody else got something to say? Go ahead, Neil.
I'll take a shot, Tim. First of all, I have a tremendous amount of respect for people that take this attitude of responsibility for as an individual, and this is my circle of influence, and I'm going to do the right thing within that circle. What that can do on a large scale is really hard to say, because we can't force other people to adopt that same attitude. And in the meantime, let's take the United States, for instance. The United States has the highest per capita water usage on the planet. But the fact of the matter is 80% of all water usage by humans, of freshwater use by humans, is for agriculture. So the comparison I like is the entire city of San Diego uses about 500,000 acre-feet of water in a year. And just across the mountains in the Imperial Valley, they've got 500,000 acres where they're using, you know, $800 worth of water to produce $200 worth of alfalfa. But they're consuming 3.2 million acre-feet of water every year, you know, for a small agricultural scale. It's 6 times what the whole city of San Diego does. And so, you know, as a suburban or an urban person where you're like, well, I've cut my water usage by 15% because I lick my dishes, that's great. But even if all of us lick our dishes, 80% of the water is still being used by farmers growing monocrops. And so if we are going to make a big enough change on a big enough scale, we need to go to the places where that consumption is the biggest. Not to deride that attitude of personal responsibility, because I admire it a great deal. But most of us live in oligarchies. Oligarchies are controlling how resources are used. And so if we're going to change that, we either need to co-opt the oligarchy or we need to become it. That's my take on that.
Okay, let me add something else about agriculture. Can I talk?
Yes, please. Go ahead, yes.
Okay, Neil brought something that is actually an interesting point. Agriculture consumes water that is recycled into the atmosphere so that it will precipitate somewhere else. If you're lucky, nearby, and if you're not lucky, will go maybe across a continent. But if you have no agriculture, you have a desert, and then you don't have any water recycling. I mean, the idea that farmers consume a lot of water, farmer in many ways is a poor substitute of what used to be a natural ecosystem that consumed and recycled water and kept pumping the same water in the same time, in the same place. If we start talking in terms of you consume water and you consume less water, you're forgetting the main point is where the water comes from. Because we have the same water that we had 4,500,000 years ago in the time of the dinosaurs. You have forests where you have a lot of water recycling, and the soil, the vegetation is all part of keeping the water going around. As soon as you cut the forest, you cut part of the feedback of the water, and eventually you run into a desert. So the idea that you consume water is something that you have to treat very carefully, because in most areas with any kind of vegetation, the vegetation consumes water, but it also puts water back into the atmosphere. When you don't put water back into the atmosphere, when you make cement, and it seals a certain percentage of water, and that stays there.
Great, thank you.
And to build on that, because I think it is a very good point, it is important to frame the conversation that is not that one thing is more important than the other, or greater or lesser. I think it's more about our current strategies aren't working. That conversation is too loaded, that messaging isn't working. Let's just leave it where it's at and let's start a whole new conversation. And we can have both of these conversations going on. We don't need to stop this conversation, but I think some of us are realizing putting more energy into that conversation when there's this other one over here that maybe provides more potential to get more people on board with the messaging, because it's not so much a belief as a reality once you start making it more tangible and directly related to the earth.
I think Walter was maybe trying to unmute there.
Oh, yeah, Walter, you keep doing this. Let's do this. Okay, there we are.
Yeah.
Hey, Walter.
Okay, look, thank you very much. And these last couple of questions are very important. Effectively, we've been fibrillating for 50 years, disempowered, because in a sense we've been sold this simple, simplistic emission reduction story, which we know scientifically can't work. We can't solve the problem through just emission reductions. But we have an elegant, effective, natural solution, in a sense, through this hydrological story. So it's a simple matter to say, look, here is nature. Here is how nature created and manages a stable, healthy, safe climate. We can restore those natural processes. And the point of agency and the point of empowerment is, as we've talked about, effectively the sponge. All we have to do, whether it's your backyard, urban agriculture, regenerating deserts, just grow plants, build the sponge, build the hydrology. So in a sense, we've got a global community that's absolutely aware, absolutely scared about what's happening coming down the track. And really, here is a solution: restore nature through the point of agency, the sponge. And the point is, it doesn't matter whatever scale you do it, if it's your backyard, patio, urban agriculture, or if it's, as Neil, trying to regenerate and rehydrate that 5 billion hectares of man-made desert and wasteland that we've created over the last 8,000 years. Now, Milan is absolutely right. It's not a matter of agriculture. We have plenty of water on this planet. It's a question how efficiently it is stored and cycled and reused continually. And we do that through the sponge and through land management. So it's just moving it off from this linear dead end, we're in a crisis, to saying here is nature. It works in natural cycles. We can actually sort of engage in those cycles. We can cool the planet. We can provide enough food for the 10 billion projected by 2050. We have adequate, safe water for everybody. If we manage that sponge, we can restore biosystems, but we can also re-empower, revitalize communities. And it's all through that simple, natural regeneration. So I think that's the meme, that's the message. But yeah, let's not get caught into this divisive argument, or also, yeah, how much water have I used, as long as we do it wisely.
Right, thank you. All right, we've got 20 minutes left, probably a couple more questions. Is your hand still up, or did that? You have the mic? Okay, because I was good to you go ahead first, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, yeah.
Sure.
Positive, you were going to be next anyway, you're first, yeah.
I really just want to thank you for being a voice for the paradigm shift that we're kind of skirting around, that we're not mentioning, which is this movement back towards the dynamic of the healthy feminine voice. And moving from a thinking culture back into a feeling culture, and how this doesn't have to be divisive at all. And when we go to these communities that we're trying to infiltrate and sit with them and listen to the medicine beneath the story that they've been telling, and sit with them long enough and approach, well, how do your sons fish in this lake, and what have the changes been? And we really, really hear that, then we start to get into the body again. So when we work with the water, we're getting back into the body, which not only of the earth, but of the people, and that healthy feminine dynamic in all people is restored. And when we start feeling again, we start belonging again. So it's not about one against the other. It's just going and saying, hey, this is the reality. And I think everybody can get behind that. But we have to let their voice be the one that tells us, right? Let them tell their story about it. And so I just want to say thank you for saying, not saying what you said, and but being a voice for her or Gaia or whatever you want to say in that way. And however I can help, but I would love to go and speak with those people. I think it's also really important. I am a Port Townsend resident, and I sit in a lot of privilege, but I also come from a demographic of very, very little. I am of the people that we are trying to speak to. So I think it's important to have these healthy communities. This is my thing, where I can come in and I can get recharged. And I know because I live here, that I can go out and do this. And I may not have financial means, but I have this community to return to. But I also carry that demographic of understanding within me that can sit with a variety of demographics. So utilize me. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you pass it over here? Yeah.
In the talk about the soil sponge and just this whole discussion, I haven't heard the word tillage. And there was a prophet out on the Palouse in this state back around the late 1800s who used to say to the people, never till the ground, it's sticking a knife in your mother's breast. And it is something that I almost never hear in any of these discussions, is that for the most part, and I also heard a Nez Perce man last year say, all culture starts with food. How we gather and distribute food, in other words, energy, is how a culture then decides whether it's a sharing culture or a commodification culture, whether it's a hierarchical system, or whether it's, and then of course the stories that you tell about it, like once you have a hierarchical system, you have some form of slavery going on. So it's all integrated. The issues that we're talking about, social justice and climate, or water justice is probably a better way to talk about it, is that it's how we get the energy and distribute the energy we need to get up and get the energy that we need. And so, in other words, food. And it's a very critical part. And most people in the world have come to rely on the energy from monocrop tilled fields. Yeah. And we can do wonderful things in our gardens, and we can even plant lots of trees and so on. But if the people planting those trees are living off of monocrop tilled fields, I just want to know if anybody has anything to say about this sort of thing.
Thank you so much. And before we get to the answers, I want to thank you as well. You mentioned food. Food and music are two of the ancient things we still do together, and I really appreciate the shared music that you brought. And last night was really magical in that USO building. How many of you were there last night for that song circle? When Dee Pursehouse mentioned lichen, I've had the song in my head all day. I didn't catch the other one. I walked in late, but just sing it with me real quick. Ooh, lichen, turning light and stone into flesh and bone. Ooh, lichen, Ooh, like in turning light and stone into flesh and bone. Thank you. And then there's all these other lines, but it was beautiful. Thank you so much. Panelists, who has monoculture,
Yeah, I
tilled
wanted to jump
agriculture?
in on the tillage, and it looks like Judy does too. Judy, do you want to go first? Since
Oh, sure. Yeah, agriculture is a huge part of everything that we're discussing, and you know, the questioner was right to call us on the fact that we hadn't stated that outright. That the way we grow food, with growing food, we have the opportunity to either build the soil carbon sponge or erode and destroy the soil carbon sponge. And the kinds of agriculture that we're doing right now is unfortunately taking us in the wrong direction. And tillage is, of course, very destructive to that soil. But I also wanted just to put out there that the agricultural chemicals that are in there, you know, this has to be a part of the solution, is to shift away from these, because that's harming biodiversity, it's harming our water, it's you know, harming our food and the soil. And yes, I'll turn it over to you, Dee Dee, but it's just that we need to get that in there, that you can't really build carbon in the soil to create that sponge when you're also using a lot of nitrogen fertilizers. I know Walter has taught me a little bit about those dynamics too.
yeah, I think in the slides that I was sharing, I showed one of the soil health principles, and two of the most key principles in terms of turning that flour into bread, or turning mineral particles into a sponge. One is maximizing photosynthesis. So a lot of what we see in terms of the excessive water use in agriculture is because there aren't enough plants growing for long enough of the year. So the water is evaporating and not staying in there, and the sponge isn't forming because those photosynthates, or those sugars, aren't going down to feed the microbial communities that need to build the sponge. But the second soil health principle is to minimize or eliminate tillage. My friend John Norman, who's a biogeophysicist, says soil is a living body with a respiratory system, a digestive system, a reproductive system, etc. And you wouldn't stick a shovel into your dog for no reason, would you? So I like to think, you know, if you take the bread and stuck it in a blender, would it have that porosity? Would it have that structural integrity? And I think, you know, we've been hearing two different things from the panel. One is some of us are talking about us building a sponge to capture water. And as Minnie pointed out, of course, you need water to kickstart building the sponge. So it's really a circle. The other is more the idea of retaining water to help kickstart the water cycle. And many people confuse those two things. So I just wanted to say those are two different strategies. One is sort of the slow it and sink it idea, but the other one is rather than creating a reservoir, a human created reservoir to help keep the water in the land, is that sponge that used to cover the whole earth that other species build, that is a reservoir that is spread out all over the soil surface and under the soil surface. So, and when we talk about where the water is coming from, just want to remind us that there are, in some of the systems where they're really pumping the water out from the deeper aquifers, we're starting to have land that's collapsing, that suddenly a house will fall 20 or 30 feet into the ground. So there's the small water cycles that are going, as Professor Mian is talking about, but there's deeper water it's kind of like when we think about the carbon cycle. So carbon should be moving through, right? It's not that we don't want CO2 in the atmosphere, that the plants have the stomata to take that CO2 up. And a lot of that comes right from the soil surface where there's life breathing out, right, including us. But when we start to pull the carbon up from the deeper storage, we're changing that balance. We're turning order back into disorder. But the same thing is true with the water. So when the water is cycling in a way that is more sustainable, to use an older word, or regenerative, it's cycling really through the sponge, the vegetation, the atmosphere, etc. But if we start pulling that old deep water out of the aquifer, and then we also lose most of the water that runs off from pavement, from compacted soils, from degraded soils into the oceans, then it's a different kind of a cycle. So I think we need to think about scale here.
All right. Anyone else on the tillage monoculture thing, or are we going to go to you? Yeah. Mian, oh, I was just instructed to mute him because he was making. Okay, Mian, you are unmuted.
Okay, no, it's the point of the small water cycle, the regional water cycle, and the global cycle. They're all part of one, except they work at different times. You would have no water in any aquifer if you hadn't had plenty of rain over that area hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago. And so when people are pulling fossil water out of the soil, they're actually getting water out that was precipitated and collected by the vegetation, the sponge. The sponge leaked it into the aquifer, and now that water is there, or probably has been there for thousands of years. You know, it's the same water. It's just that the short water cycle recycles very quickly within a week or a few days, and then the regional cycle probably takes a few years, and then the continental cycle probably takes hundreds of years. But it's the same water that is being recycled at different time scales, and we cannot forget that. We have the same water now that in time of the dinosaurs, and the people who wrote that one of the short water cycle, and I can't remember the name now, they're from Czechoslovakia, they calculated that about 2 centimeters of the growth of the oceans in the last 50 years is the water that was in the soil sponge only 100 years ago. You know, you have been desiccating and tilling the ground out, and that water eventually doesn't recycle and ends up back in the oceans. You know, we have to keep into perspective that we're looking at different cycles, and they're all linked one to the other with different time and space scales. And we have to be aware of that.
Thank you. By the way, thank you. Later this summer, in the Muse Ecology podcast, had a chance to visit Professor Mian. So it'll be out later this summer, but it's going to be like 2 or 3 hours long probably, because there's just so much good convo. Just to let you know that's coming up. But we got a question right here.
He has a lot of good stuff to say.
Yeah, I mean, and there's papers online, but it's just any of these people I highly recommend looking into more. This is just a touch in, just a 2.5 hour quick tease, you know. Yeah.
My contribution will just be really quick. I've been listening to everybody over the last couple of days, and maybe the mime that I'm suggesting a possible mime, and that would be it's because this is all, I taught geography in high school for a long time, and this is kind of all geography in a certain sense, and intuitive in some ways to indigenous peoples. What about the restoration of local water cycle in your watershed? The restoration of the local water cycle in your watershed as being a focus for restoration.
Who wants to go?
Well, that's the way you have to start. But you have to know what your water cycle is at which watershed scale. You know, so that you make sure that the water cycle is close unto itself. There is a publication from the European Commission put out in 2015, which was International Year of Soil, that discusses this, where you close the cycle. You have to make sure that where you evaporate in one place end up in the aquifer someplace that will feed back again into the marsh or into the whatever it is that is evaporating the water. Just like in the tropic, you evaporate locally and you precipitate locally during the rainy season, for instance. So that has to be known. I mean, different places is different. But I would agree with the person who just thought that the first thing you have to know is what your watershed looks like and what happens if you change things in one end, what happens at the other end.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We that's the time now. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to you two. Thank you to all you 6 out there in the world on the screen. Thanks to everybody online for showing up. Thank you all you for your questions and being. And once again, I'm Tim. Since I'll say it twice, since to make up for forgetting all those. Tim's X Hour Muse Ecology Podcast. And thank you so much. Some of the upcoming episodes, few of the people are on, and anything you can check out of all these people's work, highly recommend. And there's other folks, we couldn't fit them onto the panel, but like you mentioned, Rain for Climate, Travis, and there's a lot of, we're getting it. We're going to get this. Thank you.
Yeah, I would say Rain for Climate and the New Water Paradigm is a big one. The Flow Partnership and what they're going to launch with their Global Water School. You probably have more.
I mean, anything by any of the people on this panel.
Yeah.
Yeah. Dee and Judy have really amazing books that, carry a piece of this information.
Professor Mian, you might want to plug your book that you're going to finish soon, right?
Hopefully it's called Soil and Precipitation Feedbacks, semicolon, a trip through very incommodious meteorology. Because it's very difficult to explain how these cycles work at the different scales and that they're all part of the same thing. Anyway, I hope to finish it sometime. Thank you.
Oh, and if it's okay, I'll a little plug here is that my book, Water in Plain Sight, Hope for a Thirsty World, in which I interview Walter at length. It's just out in paperback, and the preface is about, well, it's based on my conversations with Mian in Spain.
And I'll just say that a lot of Walter Yena's videos that we've put together are on the rehydratecalifornia.org website. That's probably the best place to find them and some other great ones by other folks who also should have been here in one place.
And I would also like to say that there is within all of us the knowledge of what we can do. And so while there is wonderful information outside, there is also information inside. And the power of quiet individual action, which nobody knows, but which we take individually in our lives, adds up to contributing to regenerating our local water cycles, the regional water cycles, and the global water cycles. We have the power. We have the power to choose what we eat, the kind of food we buy, the kind of farming we encourage, the kind of water, what goods we buy, how much water goes. So that power is within us. So a lot of information does reside within us. So keep going, make the right choices from the power of your own being.
Yes. Any other last plugs from the panel or recommendations for future research before we go? I think we covered quite a bit. Thank you.
We have a course starting. We have a course starting tomorrow.
Great.
Financial assistance for anyone who needs it. If you go to landandleadership.org, Jeff Goebel is teaching about creating policy based on consensus and holistic decision making. And I think it's going to be a really great.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And thank you for moderating all this.
You bet.